Hello, this is Alan Brooks, and welcome to another New Discovery series, a teaching on the end of time. You know, I've spent 30 years researching the end-time prophecies of the Bible, and I made a brand new discovery that the Bible is not a lot of prophecies about a lot of different things like we've previously thought, that it is instead, most of it in the Old Testament and the New Testament, one prophecy about one thing, the Lord coming back, and what happens just before he comes back. Now, don't you think that's the most important thing we all need to know? I mean, back in the day, the saints asked Paul, "Hey, Paul, did we miss the second coming? Did we miss the rapture?" And Paul said, "No. Don't be disturbed by some letter or deed coming from even the apostles. You cannot miss the rapture unless you see these two things, unless you see the Antichrist in the temple and his armies invading Jerusalem, Israel fleeing out of town, and unless you see a great apostasia, or falling away, as he put it." And Paul said that in 2 Thessalonians 2. Now, did Jesus say anything like that? He did. He said in Matthew 24, the disciples asked him, "Hey, Jesus, man, what's going to happen? What are the signs of your coming?" Now, Jesus did not say, "You know, guys, there's no signs for my coming. I'm coming back like a thief at any moment, so always be ready." No, he said there's certain signs. There's a certain sequence of events. And you know what? Funny as it may be, he said the same thing Paul said. He said, unless you see the Antichrist in the temple, or the abomination that causes desolation in Matthew 24:15, unless you see that, I cannot come back. That's pretty much what Jesus said. And what is that event, the abomination? It's where the Antichrist and his armies come into Israel and sort of desolate Israel. And as they do, the Antichrist walks into the temple and stops whatever Israeli sacrifices have been started up again. And he says, "I'm the Messiah, not Jesus, me." And when this happens, Jesus says specifically, "Israel, flee out of town. Don't get your stuff out of your house. Don't get your cloak don't come back. You better get out of town fast, and woe to the pregnant woman." Now, why did Jesus say that? Well, you know, if I'm right and the Muslims are the Antichrist armies, you know, what do the Muslims want? They hate Israel. They hate the Jews. They would kill every one of them, every last man, woman, and child. They would knife them to death. They would kill pregnant women. They would do anything to kill every Jew and to take over Israel. That's what a lot of Islamic leaders even say. The head of Iran says that constantly. We want to destroy the little Satan, Israel, and the great Satan, the United States. But what I want to talk to you today about is there's a starting point for the end of time, and it's that flee word is a big key word. I think we've all been taught to kind of skip over that word and to think that the Antichrist is some wonderful, great, peaceful leader of this world, and he's going to stroll through the streets of Jerusalem to the adulation of the crowds. Then, all of a sudden, without warning, he's going to go into the temple and do the abomination thing where he says, "I'm the real Messiah, I'm God, let's stop these sacrifices." We kind of picture that. We've kind of all been taught that all of our lives. But is that what the Bible really says? It doesn't really. Why? Because that flee word. And that flee word is not just here in Matthew 24. It's all throughout the Old Testament. And the Old Testament has the same sequence of events. Now, what is that sequence of events? The Bible speaks that the time just before Jesus Christ comes back is going to be a 42-month time. It's going to start with an event. It's going to end with an event. It's going to start with the Antichrist and his armies invading Jerusalem. It's going to last for 42 months, and it's going to end with Jesus Christ coming back in the sky. Now, I guess it would be like I've compared it before to World War II. For the United States, it started with an event, Pearl Harbor. It lasted about 42 months. and it ended with a major event, Hiroshima. So if we had a prophetic book about World War II, and we saw those three words, Pearl Harbor, 42 months, and then Hiroshima, if we saw that sequence of events many, many times, we would know that that's what was going to happen. Now, like people in the experts today, they come to the wrong conclusion. If they read that book, they would say, well, Pearl Harbor was attacked 50 times. Hiroshima happened 50 times. No. My discovery, which is brand new, is that the Bible repeats the same prophecies over and over again in a loop. And so if you had a museum about the World War II and you saw lots of different pictures, you would know that World War II didn't happen lots of times. It only happened once, but there were lots of pictures describing World War II. Now, doesn't that make a lot more sense? Of course it does. Jesus and Paul basically said the sequence of the end times is as follows. It's a time of peace, and then there's going to be invasion of Israel on the day of the Lord. Israel's going to flee, and then the Antichrist is going to rule for 42 months, and then Jesus Christ is going to come back and destroy the Antichrist. Now that is the sequence of the end of time. That is what Jesus and Paul taught. Where, Alan? Where did they? Well, I just mentioned a couple of places, but there's another amazing verse about the day of the Lord. Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5 said, the day of the Lord happens when people say peace, and it's a destruction. And so the question is, Alan, where is the destruction? Is it Antarctica? No, it's Israel. All of the end time action is centered around Israel. And so that's what we see over and over again, is that there's a starting event for the last 3.5 years, and then the ending event is Jesus Christ coming back, with the starting event being this Antichrist invading Israel with northern armies, causing Israel to flee. Now, one interesting verse that ties in with this is Joel 2:20. It has the ending event, which is the sun, moon, and stars being darkened, which we all know happens when Jesus Christ comes back, right? And Joel 2:20 says, I will drive the northern army far from you. And this proves basically my whole contention, that we see the sequence of events that Jesus and Paul talked about all throughout the Old Testament, which I've done something that I don't think anybody else has done. I went through the entire Old Testament and looked at all these sequences that led up to Jesus Christ coming back in the sky. Now, getting back to what I just said a minute ago, Paul said, the day of the Lord, whatever that is, happens when people say peace and safety. It's a destruction in Israel. Now, we see this same sequence of events repeated over and over and over again in the Old Testament. We see it in Ezekiel 7. It's an amazing bit of scriptures. Ezekiel 7 through 11 says, on the day and during peace, Israel will be invaded by the worst of the Gentiles. Now, wouldn't you say the Antichrist is the worst of the Gentiles? And Ezekiel 7 continues to say, these invaders will defile the secret place. And then the next chapter, Ezekiel 8, says, abominations in the temple, and 25 unfaithful Jews, perhaps converts to Islam, pray to the east. What's in the east? Mecca. So we can see an amazing little confirmation here in Ezekiel 7 and 8, that on the day it has come, the people of Israel will seek peace, but they will not find it. And that's kind of like what Paul said. On the day of the Lord, people will say peace and safety. But then Paul says, what happens next? Paul says it's a destruction. And here Ezekiel matches that word. It's a destruction comes to Israel. Then God brings the worst of the Gentiles to invade Israel. Those who survive this invasion will flee or escape or flee to the mountains. And then these invaders will defile my secret place. And Ezekiel 8, the abominations in the temple. Now, can you see this amazing scripture? This is one of my discoveries. I don't think anybody's seen it before. It matches exactly what Jesus said in Matthew 24. Jesus in Matthew 24 said that the Antichrist will invade Israel, and Luke 21 also. And then he says, when you see this invasion, flee to the mountains. And here again, Ezekiel 7 matches that. It matches both Jesus and Paul. On the day when people say there's peace, there's going to be a destruction. And what is that destruction? It's an Islamic invasion force led by the Antichrist, the worst of the Gentiles. And then when he comes in, you need to flee out of town, Jesus said. Don't even get your stuff out of your house. Don't get your cloak. Better get out of town fast because Islamic armies are really bad. Then Jesus said, what's the thing that these Islamic armies are going to do? They're going to set up the abomination, which is the act of the Antichrist stopping sacrifices in a Jewish temple and proclaiming himself the Mahdi, or the Muslim Messiah. Now, can you see how over these two chapters there's an amazing confirmation of what Jesus and Paul said? And so if I am right, and this is about that last 3.5 years, what would we expect to happen next? Well, the Antichrist is going to rule for 3.5 years, and then we're going to see the wrath of God fall as Jesus Christ comes back in the air. And lo and behold, what do we see over the next few chapters in Ezekiel? We see Jesus Christ leaving the temple in heaven, Ezekiel 10, and then he comes back and stands on a mountain to the east of Jerusalem. Now, isn't that amazing, folks? Jesus asked, what are the signs of your coming? He said, my coming, these are the signs. You're going to see the Antichrist in the temple. Paul said you're going to see an invasion and a destruction to Israel when people say peace. And then you're going to see the Antichrist come into that temple and defile it. And he's going to stop the sacrifices and set up the abomination. We see word for word those predictions here. And then Jesus said, after the Antichrist has ruled for 42 months, after that, I'm going to come back and destroy this Antichrist. And that's exactly what Ezekiel 10 and 11 say. They say that Jesus will leave, the glory will leave heaven in Ezekiel 10, and then Ezekiel 11, the glory will come back and stand on a mountain to the east of Jerusalem. Now, that's an amazing fulfillment of prophecy, and it's an exact sequence match for what Jesus said. He said you're going to see the Antichrist in the temple, and then he's going to reign for 42 months, and then I'm going to come back in the sky. Isn't that amazing how there's a secret prophecy here in Ezekiel 7 through 11? It's my discovery, even though I'm not that smart. And you see it here in the Old Testament. What are some other examples? Well, Ezekiel 12 through 17 is a repetition or another loop of the same information. It starts out with an invasion. It mentions Israel being destroyed by her lovers and desolated, which is why Jesus calls this the abomination that causes desolation, the desolation of Israel. And then Jesus said at the end, at Ezekiel 17, from the highest branch, a twig is placed on a high mountain. Can you see how this matches exactly what he just said? There's an invasion sequence of events that ends with Jesus Christ, the branch in many places in the Old Testament, coming back and standing on a high mountain. And then we see in Zechariah 14 the same sequence of events again. Jerusalem is invaded. People have to flee out of town. And then at the end of that, Jesus Christ comes back and stands on a high mountain. Now, isn't this stunning and amazing that you see here 3 different Old Testament prophets have the same sequence of events that Jesus and Paul had? Of course, it's amazing and stunning. But did you see something else here? Or kind of like what you didn't see? You see, we know for a fact that this Antichrist, after he invades, he's going to rule for 42 months. It says that in several places in Revelation and many places in Daniel. But we don't have these prophets saying that. When you see all these places in the Old Testament, you see a peace, an invasion, and then it seems like the Lord comes back at Armageddon right after that. I don't think that's what really is going to happen. I think that most of these Old Testament prophets really didn't know about the 42 months thing, like Jesus and Daniel said. But we do know that's going to happen. So I think you have to put that in there after this invasion. And then it makes a lot more sense. Then after the 42 months, the Lord comes back and stands on a mountain east of Jerusalem. Now, doesn't that seem to make more sense? Yes, it does. The final end time sequence in Jesus and Paul and in Ezekiel 7 through 11 and 12 through 17 and Zechariah 14 is the same. At the end of time, on the day of the Lord, Israel's going to be invaded. And we know this invasion starts in the middle of the final 7 years. And we know it starts the last 42 months of time. Although these guys didn't say that. But we have to put it in. And then after that 42 months, according to Jesus and John and Daniel, after that 42 months, the Lord Jesus Christ comes back and destroys this Antichrist in Israel. That's the final sequence of events. Now, where else is it, Alan? What other places mention this amazing sequence of events? Well, we can go to Jeremiah 1 through 4 and 6 through 8. Once again, in another loop, we see that God matches his prophets throughout the Bible. Jeremiah 4, the code word peace. Then Jeremiah says, invasion from the north. Jerusalem is plundered. Flee. Now, that's exactly what we've been seeing, right? Jesus said, when you see the Antichrist come into the temple, flee. He said in Luke 21, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, flee. Now, as a side note, a lot of people say Luke 21 happened in AD 70. I don't think so, because the disciples asked Jesus, what's the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And as far as I know, Luke 21 back in 2,000 years ago, Jesus didn't come back, and the end of the age didn't happen, right? So Jeremiah 4, we see an exact match. During peace, like Paul said, the day of the Lord starts, which we've seen as an invasion from the north. Jerusalem is plundered, flee. And so the next thing we have to add in is that 42 months. So after the Antichrist has ruled for 42 months, what happens? The earth shall mourn. The mountains tremble with an earthquake. There's no light in the heavens. So that's exactly what happens when Jesus Christ comes back. There's a great earthquake. The mountains tremble, and there's no light as the sun, moon, and stars are darkened as Jesus Christ comes back. So Jeremiah 4 is yet another repetition or loop of the same end-time sequence of events. Jeremiah 6 has the same thing, a false peace. Destruction from the north. Flee. Then the Lord returns and causes mourning. Remember Zechariah 14, it says, they will see the one, Zechariah 12:10, I'm sorry. They will see the one they have pierced and mourn. So once again, Jeremiah 6 has this same information. A false peace, destruction from the north, flee, and then 42 months later, the Lord returns in the sky and causes mourning. Can you see how the same story is being repeated over and over throughout the whole Bible? That the Antichrist is going to invade Israel, cause her to flee. He's going to rule for 42 months as they desolate Israel. Now, if you remember when Israel gave the West Bank to the Palestinians, they just didn't come in and move into all those wonderful accommodations. No, they devastated them all. They tore them down because they hate the Jews. Now, can we see how these predictions are making more sense in the light of what we know about Islam and Muslims today? Of course it does. So Jeremiah 4 has the same sequence of events. During peace, there's an invasion from the north. Jerusalem is plundered. Flee. Then we have to add in that 42 months. The earth shall mourn as Jesus Christ comes back. Jeremiah 6 has the same information, a false peace and a destruction from the north, like Paul said. The day is a destruction upon Israel. Then Jeremiah 6 says, flee. We add in the 42 months, and at the end of Jeremiah 6, it says, the Lord returns and causes mourning. And we compare those to Ezekiel. A peaceful Israel is invaded from the north. Flee. Israel is destroyed. And then 42 months later, a great earthquake happens, Armageddon takes place, and Jesus Christ comes back and stands on a high mountain. And when we compare that to what Jesus and Paul said when people say peace, 1 Thessalonians 5, the sudden destruction of the day of the Lord happens. And then what is that? It's the Antichrist surrounding Jerusalem with armies, which causes them to flee. Then we know the Antichrist rules for 42 months, although Jesus didn't specifically mention that. And then the sun, moon, and stars are darkened, Jesus said, after the tribulation, and I come back in the sky and I cause mourning. So we can see how the same God used the same words and phrases to describe the same events throughout the same Bible. It's the same story over and over again, which is why I call my book The Loop, available on Amazon.com. You can get it, and it's has a special sale price right now. Thank you. Continuing on, Jeremiah 9 has the same events. It says, Jerusalem will be in ruins because they have forsaken me. Israel will say, we're plundered. Remember, Zechariah said Israel's plundered. Then it says, then 42 months later, it says Armageddon happens, where I will feed the people wormwood, the same wormwood that was in the book of Revelation. Then it says, no one is even left to bury the dead. So once again, we see that sequence of events in Jeremiah 9. An invasion to start the last 3.5 years. Israel's plundered, and then after the Antichrist has ruled 3.5 years, Armageddon with wormwood, the same thing that Revelation speaks of. Wormwood, a great star which goes into the ocean, which poisons the waters. Jeremiah 10 repeats it again, a commotion from the north. This will make Israel desolate. And then Jeremiah 12 and 13 say, the plunderers have come from the north, labor pains. If you remember, Jesus said the end would be like labor pains. So you can see there's one sequence of events over and over again. And the key ingredient is the north. Remember I talked to you about how Joel said in Joel 2:20, I will drive the northern army far from you. So who is that? In Daniel 11, it speaks of a northern king, the Antichrist, invading the king of the south, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and then moving over and invading Israel. That's what this is all about here. It is a northern king and a northern army, and it's the same information repeated over and over again. Jeremiah 14, it says, false prophets say peace. I, the Lord, will consume Israel by sword and by famine. And then Jeremiah 19 says, the valley of Hinnom will be the valley of slaughter. Corpses will be food for birds, but the city will be desolate. Once again, we see the code word, desolation, as in the abomination that causes desolation. We see that theme all throughout Isaiah too, which we'll get into in the next teaching about the loop and how these loops keep on appearing. But you see, the theme of Isaiah and much of the Old Testament is, I allowed you to be struck, Israel, for a brief moment, and then I will redeem you. That's what it says in Isaiah 54. He allows them to be struck and be made desolate, be a desolate nation, and then Jesus Christ will come back, and with his church he'll inhabit the cities of Jerusalem to start the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Now, isn't that stunning and amazing that we see the same sequence of events predicted over and over again in the Old Testament? Yes, it is. You can get The Loop by Alan Brooks on Amazon.com and on Kindle. And email me if you have any questions at all, abrook8, no S, at AOL.com. Thank you very much. This is the end of Part 1, Old Testament New Discoveries about the End of Time.